No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's. That as men busied themselves about their affairs, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. At most, terrestrial men fancied that there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise, but certainly no one thought of Mars as a source of human danger. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area, and remoter from the Sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from life's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know now that even in its equatorial region, the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. The atmosphere of Mars is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole, and periodically inundate its temperate zones. That last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamt of, they see at its nearest distance of only 35 million of miles sunward of them a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and blue with water, with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone into its cooling, and our world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is indeed their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them. The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the way, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war. But they failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. It is almost 6 years now since the storm burst upon us. That year, as Mars approached opposition, Lavelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. His spectroscope indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards the Earth. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame, suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet. He described it as similar in effect to the flaming gases rushing out of the mouth of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase, it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news and invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. I can still see the black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue with the little red planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a small thing, so bright and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes and slightly flattened from the perfect round. 40 million miles away it was, 40 million miles of void, and invisible to me because it was so remote and small. Flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death. That night, too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it. A reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline of the planet. And another invisible missile started on its way to Earth just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here, there, and everywhere. It seems to me almost incredible now that with that swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. One night, I remember, I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her and pointed out Mars, a brilliant dot of light creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into melody by the distance. It all seemed so safe and tranquil. And yet, all unsuspected, those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space. The first falling star appeared very early one morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, stated that the height of its first appearance was about 90 or 100 miles. I was at home, working late and writing in my study at the time, and although my French windows faced southeastwards and the blind was up, I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to Earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Many people in Berkshire, Surrey, and Middlesex must have seen the fall of it, but no one seems to have troubled to look for it that night. Ogilvy had seen it, however, and he set out soon after dawn with the idea of finding it, and find it he did, not far from the sandpits on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw, and Woking. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the heath and heather, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree it had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder, caked over, its outline softened by a thick, scaly, dun-coloured incrustation. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. Ogilvy approached the mass, surprised at the size, and more so at the shape, since most meteorites are rounded more or less completely. It was, however, still so hot, from its flight through the air, as to forbid his near approach. A stirring noise within the cylinder he ascribed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at that time it had not occurred to him that it might be hollow. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, dimly perceiving even then some evidence of design in its arrival. The early morning was wonderfully still, and the sun, just clearing the pine trees towards Weybridge, was already warm. There was no breeze stirring, and the only sounds were the faint movements from within the cindery cylinder. Then suddenly he noticed with a start that some of the grey clinker, the ashy incrustation that covered the cylinder, was falling off the circular edge of the end. It was dropping in flakes and raining down upon the sand. A large piece suddenly came off and fell with a sharp noise that brought his heart into his mouth. For a minute he scarcely realized what this meant. He fancied even then that the cooling of the body might account for it, but what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from the end of the cylinder. And then he perceived that very slowly the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body. It was such a gradual movement that he discovered it only through noticing that a black mark that had been near him 5 minutes ago was now at the other side of the circumference. Even then he scarcely understood what this indicated until he heard a muffled grating sound and saw the black mark jerk forward an inch or so. Then it came upon him in a flash. The cylinder was hollow, artificial, with an end that screwed out, and something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. He turned at once, scrambling away from the edge of the pit, and set off running wildly into Woking. He met a waggoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told and his appearance were so wild that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman who was just unlocking the doors of the public house by Horsell Bridge. But when he saw Henderson, the London journalist, in his garden, he called over the palings and at last made himself understood. "Henderson," he called, "you saw that shooting star last night?" "What about it?" said Henderson. "It's out on Horsell Common now." "Good Lord," cried Henderson, "a fallen meteorite, that's a good scoop." "But it's not a meteorite," said Ogilvy excitedly. "It's a cylinder, an artificial cylinder, and there's something inside." With an exclamation, Henderson dropped his spade, snatched up his jacket, and ran down to the railway station at once in order to telegraph the news to London. The newspaper articles had already prepared men's minds for the reception of the idea to some extent, and by 8 o'clock the word had got around, and a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the Common to see the men from Mars. That was the form the story took, and I heard of it first from my newspaper boy about 9:15 when I went out to get my Daily Chronicle. I was naturally startled and lost no time in going out and across Ottershaw Bridge to the sandpits. When I arrived, I found a crowd of several hundred people surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. Everyone seemed greatly excited. There were a number of voices raised, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the edge of the pit. As I drew nearer, I heard Ogilvy's voice shouting, "Keep back! Keep back!" A boy came running towards me. "It's a-moving!" he shouted as he passed. "I don't like it! I'm a-going home!" The crowd swayed a little, and I elbowed my way through. "He's fallen in the pit!" a voice shouted. I reached the edge of the pit, and Ogilvy saw me. "I say!" he shouted. "Help keep those idiots back! We don't know what's in this confounded thing!" A young man was standing on the cylinder itself and trying to scramble out of the hole. The pressure of the crowd had pushed him in. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw now projected from the end of the cylinder, and as I watched, the screw came out completely, and the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men, but in all essentials a man. I know I did. But what we did see was something resembling a little grey snake, about the thickness of a walking stick, which coiled up out of the blackness within the cavity and wriggled in the air towards us. It was followed by another and another, until 8 of these tentacles waved sinuously in the air before our eyes. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind, and astonishment gave place to horror on the faces of the people about me. Then a big, greyish, rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, rose slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. 2 large, dark-coloured eyes regarded us steadfastly. There was a mouth under the eyes, the brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the movements unspeakably terrible. Even at this first encounter I was overcome with disgust and dread. Suddenly the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit, with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar, thick cry, and forthwith a second creature appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. At that the crowd turned and rushed madly, blindly for the cover of the trees surrounding the common. I made for the nearest group of trees, perhaps 100 yards away, and there, among some young pines and furze bushes, I stopped, panting, and awaited further developments. And then, with a renewed horror, I saw a round, black object bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit. It was the head of the young man who had fallen in. He got his shoulder and knee up, and then he slipped back again until only his head was visible. Suddenly he vanished, and a faint shriek reached me through the afternoon air. The afternoon was fading to twilight before anything further happened. There had scarcely been an intimation of movement from the pit, and it was this as much as anything that gave people courage. As the dusk came on, a slow, intermittent movement upon the sandpits began, a movement that seemed to gather force as the stillness of the early evening about the cylinder remained unbroken. Vertical black figures in twos and threes would advance, stop, watch, and advance again, spreading out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent. I too began to move towards the pit. And then, within 30 yards of the pit edge, advancing from the direction of Horsell, I noticed a little black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. I learned later that it had been decided that since the Martians were, in spite of their repulsive forms, evidently intelligent creatures, it might be advantageous to show them by approaching them with signals that we too were intelligent. Flutter, flutter went the little flag, first to the right, then to the left. Closer and closer the little knot of men approached the edge of the pit. And then, suddenly, there was a flash of light, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs which drove up one after the other straight into the still air. This smoke, or flame perhaps would be the better word for it, was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown common towards Chertsey, set with black pine trees, seemed to darken abruptly as these puffs arose, and to remain the darker after their dispersal. A faint hissing sound became audible, changing gradually into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Then, very slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Immediately flashes of flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men at the edge of the pit. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame, as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. By the light of their own destruction I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that little distant crowd. As the unseen shaft of heat passed over them, pine trees burst into fire, and every dry furze bush became a mass of flames. It was sweeping round swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I perceived it coming towards me by the flashing bushes it touched, and I heard the crackle of fire in the sandpits and the sudden squeal of a horse that was as suddenly stilled. All along a curving line beyond the sandpits, the dark ground smoked and crashed. Something fell with a crash far away to the left, where the road from Woking Station opens out on the common. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the hissing and humming ceased, and the black dome-like object sank slowly out of sight into the pit. All this had happened with such swiftness that I had stood motionless, dumbfounded and dazzled by the flashes of light. Had that death swept through a full circle, it must inevitably have slain me in my surprise. But it passed and spared me, and left the night about me suddenly dark and unfamiliar, except where patches of bush and isolated trees smoked and glowed, and some houses towards Woking Station sent up spires of flame into the stillness of the evening air. With an effort I turned and began to run, stumbling through the heather. That night nearly 40 people lay under the starlight about the pit, charred and distorted beyond recognition, and all night long the common from Horsell to Maybury was deserted and brightly ablaze. I remember very little of my headlong flight until I found myself near the bridge that crosses the canal by the gasworks. For a moment I could not clearly understand how I came to be there. My hat had gone and my collar had burst away from its stud. I walked unsteadily up the steep incline of the bridge, my mind a blank wonder, my muscles and nerves drained of their strength. I dare say I staggered drunkenly. Over the Maybury Arch a train, a billowing tumult of white firelit smoke and a long caterpillar of lighted windows, went flying south with a clatter and was gone. A dim group of people talked in the gate of one of the houses in the pretty little row of gables that was called Oriental Terrace. It was all so real and so familiar, and that behind me, it was fantastic, unbelievable. Such things, I told myself, just could not be. I arrived home some 20 minutes later and startled my wife at the doorway, so haggard was my appearance. I went into the dining room, sat down, drank some wine, and so soon as I could collect myself sufficiently told her the things I had seen. The dinner had already been served and remained neglected on the table while I told my story. "There is one thing," I said, to allay the fears I saw I'd aroused in her. "They are the most sluggish things I ever saw. They may keep the pit and kill people who come near them, but they cannot get out of it." I paused, remembering. Oh, but the horror of them. "Don't, dear," said my wife, putting her hand on mine. "Poor Ogilvy and Henderson," I said, "to think of them lying dead out there." When I saw how deadly white my wife's face was, I tried to reassure her again. I began to comfort her, and myself, by repeating all I knew of the impossibility of the Martians establishing themselves on the Earth. In particular, I laid stress on the gravitational difficulty. On the surface of the Earth, the force of gravity is 3 times what it is on the surface of Mars. A Martian, therefore, would weigh 3 times more than on Mars, albeit his muscular strength would be the same. His own body would be a cope of lead to him. That indeed was the general opinion, and both the Times and the Daily Telegraph insisted on it the next morning. But both overlooked, just as I did, 2 obvious modifying influences. The atmosphere of the Earth contains far more oxygen than does that of Mars. The invigorating influences of this excess of oxygen upon the Martians indisputably did much to counterbalance the increased weight of their bodies. And in the second place, we all overlooked the fact that such mechanical intelligence as the Martians possessed was quite able to dispense with muscular exertion at a pinch. But I did not consider these points at the time, and so my reasoning was dead against the chances of the invaders. With wine and food, the confidence of my own table, and the necessity of reassuring my wife, I grew, by degrees, courageous and secure. "They've done a foolish thing," said I, fingering my wine-glass. "They're dangerous because no doubt they're mad with terror. Perhaps they expected to find no living things, certainly no intelligent living things. 1 artillery shell in the center of that pit will kill them all." I remember that dinner table with extraordinary vividness even now, my dear wife's sweet, anxious face peering at me from under the pink lampshade, the white cloth with its silver and glass table furniture, for in those days even philosophical writers had many little luxuries. The crimson-purple wine in my glass, all are photographically distinct. I did not know it, but that was the last civilized dinner I was to eat for very many strange and terrible days. So that was the state of things on Friday night. In the center, sticking into the skin of our old planet Earth like a poisoned dart, was the cylinder. But the poison was scarcely working yet. Around it was a patch of silent common smouldering in places, with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in contorted attitudes, and here and there a burning bush or tree. Beyond, and at a safe distance, well away from the common itself, there was a fringe of excitement, a curious crowd of people coming and going, both on the Chobham and Horsell bridges. 1 or 2 adventurous souls, it was afterwards found, went into the darkness and crawled quite near the Martians. But they never returned, for now and again a light ray, like the beam of a warship's searchlight, swept the common, and the dreadful heat ray was ready to follow. And all night long the Martians were hammering and stirring, sleepless, indefatigable, at work upon the machines they were making ready, and ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke whirled up to the starlit sky. About 11 o'clock a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form a cordon. Later a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. The colonel of the regiment came to the Chobham bridge and was busy questioning the crowd at midnight, and at about the same time a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxim guns, and about 400 men of the Cardigan regiment started from Aldershot. The military authorities were now certainly alive to the seriousness of the business. A few seconds after midnight, the crowd in the Chertsey Road at Woking saw a star fall from the heavens into the pine woods to the northwest. It fell with a greenish light, causing a flash like summer lightning. This was the second cylinder. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, with a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little, and I rose early and went into my garden before breakfast. I stood listening, but towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk down towards the common. Under the railway bridge I found a group of soldiers, sappers, I think, men in small round caps, dirty red jackets unbuttoned and showing their blue shirts, dark trousers and boots coming to the calf. They told me no one was allowed over the canal, and looking along the road towards the bridge, I saw one of the cardigan men standing sentinel there. I did not succeed in getting a glimpse of the common, for even Horsell and Chobham church towers were in the hands of the military authorities. The soldiers I addressed didn't know anything. The officers were mysterious as well as busy. I found people in the town quite secure again in the presence of the military. The soldiers had made the people on the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. I must confess, the sight of all this armament, all this preparation, greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent and defeated invaders in a dozen striking ways. Something of my schoolboy dreams of battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me at that time. The Martians seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon there began the thud of a gun, at measured intervals, from Chertsey or Addlestone. I learnt that the smouldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was being shelled, in the hope of destroying that object before it opened. It was not until about 5 o'clock, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 in the evening, as I sat at tea with my wife in the summer house, talking vigorously about the battle that was lowering upon us, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing. Close on the heels of that came a violent, rattling crash quite close to us that shook the ground, and starting out upon the lawn I saw the tops of the trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church beside it slide down into ruin. The pinnacle of the tower of the college had vanished, and the roofline of the college building itself looked as if a 100-ton gun had been at work upon it. One of our chimneys cracked as if a shot had hit it, flew up and came clattering down the tiles to land a heap of broken red fragments upon the flower bed by my study window. I and my wife stood amazed. Then I realized that the crest of Maybury Hill upon which our house stood must be within range of the Martian's heat ray, now that the college was cleared out of the way. At that I gripped my wife's arm and without ceremony ran her out into the road. Then I fetched out the servant. "We can't possibly stay here," I said, and as I spoke, the firing reopened for a moment on the common. "But where are we to go?" said my wife in terror. I thought for a moment and then remembered my cousins. "Leatherhead!" I shouted above the sudden noise. My wife looked away from me downhill. The people were coming out of their houses astonished. "How are we to get to Leatherhead?" my wife shouted. "Stop here," I said. "Keep under cover, down here by this hedge." And I started off at a run for the Crown and Anchor, for I knew the landlord there had a horse and dog cart. I ran, for I perceived that in a moment everyone on this side of the hill would be moving. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. 3 galloped past me, and in through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted, and began running from house to house. The sun, shining through the smoke that drove up from the tops of the trees, seemed blood-red, and threw an unfamiliar, lurid light upon everything. I found the landlord in his bar, apparently quite unaware of what was going on behind his house. I explained hastily that I thought it wise to leave my house at once, and managed to secure the dog-cart and horse for a fee of £2 and a promise to return it without fail by midnight. At the time it did not seem to me nearly so urgent that the landlord should leave his house. I took care to have the cart there and then, and drove it off down the road. Leaving it in charge of my wife and servant, I rushed into my house and packed a few valuables in a tablecloth, then dragged the bundle out onto the road. The beech trees below the house were burning while I did this, and the palings up the road glowed red. 2 of the dismounted hussars came running up. They were going from house to house, warning people to leave. "What news?" I shouted. One of them turned and yelled, "They're out of the pit!" Then he bawled something about crawling about in a thing like a giant dish cover, and ran on to the gate of the house at the crest, followed by his companion. A sudden whirl of black smoke driving across the road hid them for a moment. Hastily bundling everything into the dog-cart, I jumped up into the driver's seat beside my wife. The servant was already seated in the cart, and in another moment we were clear of the smoke and noise, and spanking down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill towards Old Woking. At the bottom of the hill I turned my head to look back at the hillside I was leaving. Thick streamers of black smoke shot with threads of red fire were driving up into the still air, and throwing dark shadows upon the green treetops eastward. The smoke already extended far away to the east and west, to the Byfleet pine woods eastward, and to Woking in the west. The road was dotted with people running in the direction we were headed, and very faint now but very distinct through the hot, quiet air one heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, and an intermittent cracking of rifles. I am not an expert driver, and I had immediately to turn my attention to the horse. When I looked back again, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I slashed the horse with the whip, and gave him a loose rein until Woking lay between us and that quivering tumult. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest while I took my supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. My wife was curiously silent throughout the drive and seemed oppressed with forebodings of evil. I talked to her reassuringly, pointing out that the Martians must be tied to their pit by sheer heaviness, and at the utmost could but crawl a little out of it, but she answered only in monosyllables. Had it not been for my promise to the innkeeper to return his cart, she would, I think, have urged me to stay in Leatherhead that night. Would that I had. Her face, I remember, was very white when we parted. It was nearly 11 when I started to return. The night was unexpectedly dark. To me, walking out of the lighted passage of my cousin's house, it seemed indeed black, and it was as hot and close as the day. Overhead the clouds were driving fast, albeit not a breath stirred the shrubs about us. As I came through Woking, I saw along the western horizon a blood-red glow, which as I drew nearer crept slowly up the sky. The driving clouds of the gathering thunderstorm mingled there with masses of black and red smoke. From Ripley until I came through Purford, I was in the valley of the Wey, and the red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill beyond Purford Church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered with the first intimation of the storm that was upon us. Then I heard midnight pealing out from Purford Church behind me, and then came the silhouette of Maybury Hill with its tree-tops and roofs black and sharp against the red. Even as I beheld this, a lurid green light lit the road about me and showed the distant woods towards Addlestone. I felt a tug at the reins. I saw that the driving clouds had been pierced, as it were, by a thread of green fire, suddenly lighting their confusion and falling into the fields to my left. It was the third falling star. Close on its apparition, and blindingly violent by contrast, the first lightning of the gathering storm danced out, and the thunder burst like a rocket overhead. The horse took the bit between his teeth and bolted. A moderate incline runs down towards the foot of Maybury Hill, and down this we clattered. Once the lightning had begun, it went on in as rapid a succession of flashes as I had ever seen. The flickering light was blinding and confusing, and a thin hail smote gustily at my face as I drove down the slope. At first I regarded little but the road before me, and then abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill. At first I took it for the wet roof of a house, but one flash following another showed it to be in swift, rolling movement. It was an elusive vision, a moment of bewildering darkness, and then in a flash like daylight, the red masses of the orphanage near the crest of the hill, the green tops of the pine trees, and this problematical object came out clear and sharp and bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career, a walking engine of glittering metal, with articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantly, as it seemed, with the next flash, 100 yards nearer. Then suddenly the trees in the pine wood ahead of me were parted, as brittle reeds are parted by a man thrusting through them, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing, as it seemed, headlong towards me, and I was galloping hard to meet it. At the sight of the second monster my nerve went altogether. Not stopping to look again, I wrenched the horse's head round to the right, and in another moment the dog-cart had heeled over upon the horse. The shaft smashed noisily, and I was flung sideways and fell heavily into a shallow pool of water. I crawled out almost immediately and crouched, my feet still in the water, under a clump of firs. The horse lay motionless, his neck broken, and by the lightning flashes I saw the black bulk of the overturned dog-cart and the silhouette of the wheel still spinning slowly. In another moment the colossal mechanism went striding by me and passed uphill towards Purford. Seen nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere insensate machine driving on its way. Machine it was, with a ringing metallic pace, and long, flexible, glittering tentacles, one of which gripped a young pine tree, swinging and rattling about its strange body. But it picked its road as it went striding along, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved to and fro with the inevitable suggestion of a head looking about it. As it passed, it set up an exultant, deafening howl that drowned the thunder. In another minute it was with its companion, and 1/2 mile away, stooping over something in the field. I have no doubt that this thing in the field was the third of the 10 cylinders they'd fired at us from Mars. It was some time before my blank astonishment would let me struggle up the bank and push on towards my house. I walked among the trees trying to find the footpath up the hill. It was very dark indeed in the wood, for the lightning was now becoming infrequent, and the hail, which was pouring down in a torrent, fell in columns through the heavy foliage. Near the top of the hill I stumbled upon something soft, and by a flash of lightning saw between my feet a heap of black broadcloth and a pair of boots. Overcoming the repugnance natural to one who had never before touched a dead body, I turned him over to feel for his heart. His neck was broken, and he was quite dead. The lightning flashed a second time, and his face leapt upon me. It was the landlord of the Crown and Anchor. I stepped over him gingerly and pushed on up the hill. Reaching my house, I let myself in with my latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door, staggered to the foot of the staircase, and sat down shivering violently. After a time I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room and drank some whisky, and then I was moved to change my clothes. I made my way upstairs to my study. The window of my study looks over the trees and the railway towards Horsell Common. I crept towards the window, and as I did so the view opened out until, on the one hand, it reached to the houses about Woking Station, and on the other, to the charred and blackened pine woods of Byfleet. There was a light down below the hill on the railway near the arch, and several of the houses along the Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me at first. There was a black heap and a vivid glare, and to the right of that a row of yellow oblongs. And then I perceived that this was a wrecked train, the foreparts smashed and on fire, and the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these 3 main centres of light, the houses, the train, and the burning country towards Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. And this was the little world in which I'd been living securely for years, this fiery chaos. What had happened in the last few hours I still did not know. Nor did I know, though I was beginning to guess, the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I'd seen disgorging from the cylinder. I stared at the 3 gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sandpits. They seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms, or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, using, much as a man's brain sits and rules in his body? I began to compare the things to human machines, to ask myself for the first time in my life how an ironclad or a steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. All through the long night I sat at my study window looking at the desolation below me. And then, as the dawn grew brighter, I got up and went quietly downstairs. I realized that the house was no place to stay in. My plan was to return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I determined to take my wife to Newhaven and go with her out of the country forthwith. For I'd already perceived clearly that the country about London must inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between me and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder with its guarding giants. I determined, therefore, to go northward under cover of the woods and make a big detour by Weybridge and Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I filled a flask with whisky and lined every available pocket with packets of biscuit and slices of meat. Then I crept out of the house and ran as quickly as I could down the road by which I had come overnight. In the road lay a group of 3 charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray. And here and there were things that people had dropped, a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon, and the like poor valuables. At the corner, turning up towards the post office, a little cart filled with boxes and furniture, and horseless, heeled over on a broken wheel. There did not seem to be a living soul on Maybury Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, I suppose, by way of the old Woking Road. There was not a breath of wind this morning, and everything was strangely still as I hurried along, cutting through the woods towards Byfleet. At Byfleet Station I emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. I was far beyond the range of the heat ray here, and had it not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in some of the others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the line towards Woking, the day would have seemed very like any other Sunday. I reached Weybridge at about noon to find the whole place in such confusion as I'd never seen in any town before. Carts and carriages everywhere, the most astonishing miscellany of conveyances and horse-flesh. The respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costume, wives prettily dressed, were packing, riverside loafers energetically helping, children excited and for the most part delighted at this astonishing variation of their Sunday experience. In the midst of it all, the worthy vicar was very pluckily holding an early celebration, and his bell was jangling out above the excitement. As I crossed the railway bridge, I saw that a growing crowd of people had assembled in and about the station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow the passage of troops and guns to Chertsey, and I've heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in the special trains that were put on at a later hour. I found myself at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and the Thames join. The Wey has a treble mouth, and at this point boats are to be hired, and there was a ferry across the river. Along the bank of the river, an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives had assembled. As yet the flight had not grown to a panic, but there were already far more people than all the boats going to and fro could enable to cross. People came panting along under heavy burdens. One husband and wife were even carrying a small outhouse door between them with some of their household goods piled on top of it. There was a lot of shouting and jostling, and every now and then people would glance nervously across the way at the meadows towards Chertsey, but everything over there was still. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet, in vivid contrast with the Surrey side. The people who landed there from the boats went tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey across and was beginning to unload when a boatman near me shouted, "What's that?" "Shut up, you fool," said a man to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey, a muffled thud, the unmistakable sound of a gun. Almost immediately, unseen batteries across the river to our right took up the chorus, firing heavily, one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood arrested by the sudden stir of battle, near us and yet invisible to us. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung there, drifting. Forthwith the ground heaved underfoot and a heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in the houses near and leaving us astonished. And then quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the armoured Martians appeared, far away over the trees, across the flat meadows that stretched towards Chertsey, and striding hurriedly towards the river. Little, cowled figures they seemed at first, going with a rolling motion, and as fast as flying birds. Then, advancing obliquely towards us, came a 5th. Their armoured bodies glittered in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the unseen guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew nearer. The one on the extreme left flourished a huge case high in the air, and the ghostly, terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night smote towards Chertsey and struck the town. At sight of these strange, swift, and terrible creatures, the crowd along by the water's edge seemed for a moment horror-struck. There was no screaming or shouting, but a silence. Then came a hoarse murmur and a movement of feet, a splashing from the water. A man, too frightened to drop the portmanteau he carried on his shoulder, swung round and sent me staggering with a blow from the corner of his burden. A woman thrust at me with her hand and rushed past me. I turned too with the rush of the people, but I was not too terrified for thought. That terrible heat ray was uppermost in my mind. "Get under the water!" I shouted, and I rushed right down the gravelly beach and hurled myself headlong into the water. The stones under my feet were muddy and slippery, and the river was so low that I ran perhaps 20 feet, scarcely waist deep. Then, as the nearest Martian towered scarcely a couple of 100 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. The splashes of the people in the boats leaping into the water sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. The Martian took no more notice for the moment of the people running this way and that than a man would of the confusion of ants in a nest against which his foot had kicked. When, half suffocated, I raised my head above the water, the Martian's hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river, and as it advanced it swung loose what must have been the generator of the heat ray. In another moment it had reached the bank and was wading across. The knees of its foremost legs bent at the farther bank, and it raised itself to its full height again, close to the village of Shepperton. Forthwith, the 6 guns, which unknown to anyone on the right bank had been hidden behind the outskirts of that village, fired simultaneously. The sudden near concussion, the last close upon the first, made my heart jump. The monster was already raising the case generating the heat ray as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. Almost simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body. The hood twisted round, but not in time to dodge the 4th shell, which burst clean in its face. The hood bulged, flashed, and was whirled off in a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. "A hit! A hit!" I shouted with something between a scream and a cheer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water about me. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but recovered its balance and lurched towards Shepperton. I knew now for certain that these giants were indeed machines, and that a Martian sat in the hood of each, directing and controlling it. The living intelligence, the Martian within the hood of the machine before us, was slain and splashed to the 4 winds of heaven, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done, swerved aside, blundered on, and collapsed with a tremendous impact into the river, out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the generator of the heat ray hit the water, it flashed into steam, and in another moment a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore, but almost scaldingly hot, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screaming and shouting faintly above the seething and roar of the Martian's collapse. I splashed through the tumultuous water until I could see round the bend. 6 deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian lay across the river downstream, for the most part submerged. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and the gigantic limbs churned the water and flung a thick spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing struggled for life amidst the waves. Enormous quantities of a ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted by a furious yelling, and I saw a man knee-deep near the towpath shouting and pointing. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the river bank from the direction of Chertsey. The Shepperton guns spoke this time unavailingly. At that I ducked under the water and, holding my breath, blundered painfully along under the surface as long as I could. The water was in a tumult about me and rapidly growing hotter. I raised my head to take breath and saw the Martians. They had passed me by, and 2 were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The third and fourth stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, the other over towards Laleham. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound, a deafening and confusing conflict of noises. The clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river, and as the heat rays went to and fro over Weybridge, their impact was marked by flashes of incandescent white that gave place at once to a smoky dance of lurid flames. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping towards me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch, and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. It flickered up and down the towing path, licking off the people who ran this way and that and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose in a boiling wheel, crested with steam. In another moment the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud, and scalded, half-blinded, agonized, I staggered through the leaping, hissing water towards the shore. I fell helplessly in full sight of the Martians, upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and the Thames. I expected nothing but death. I have a dim memory of the foot of a Martian coming down within a score of yards of my head, driving straight into the loose gravel, whirling it this way and that, and lifting again. Of a long moment of suspense, and then of the four carrying the debris of their comrade between them, now clear and then presently faint, through a veil of smoke, receding interminably, as it seemed to me, across a vast space of river and meadow. And then, very slowly, I realized that by a miracle I had escaped. After giving this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common, and in their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they overlooked many a stray and unnecessary victim, such as myself. Had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith, there was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of the tidings of their approach. But they were in no hurry. From Mars, cylinder followed cylinder in its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought them reinforcements. And meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. Every minute a fresh gun came into position, until, before twilight, every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes about Kingston and Richmond masked an expectant black muzzle. And through the charred and desolated area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either cylinder save at the price of his life. The Martians spent the earlier part of the afternoon in transferring everything from the second and third cylinders at Addlestone and Purford to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, above the blackened heather and ruined buildings that stretched far and wide, stood one as sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills about Merrow, and even, it is said, from Banstead and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians behind me were thus preparing for their next sally, I made my way from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge towards London. It is a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. After some time I saw an abandoned boat drifting downstream, and throwing off most of my sodden clothes, I went after it. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle, as much as my parboiled hands would allow, down the river towards Walton and Halliford, going very tediously, and continuously looking behind me, as you may well understand. I followed the river because I considered the water gave me my best chance of escape should the Martians return. For a long time, I drifted and paddled, and at last, as the bridge at Walton was coming into sight round the bend, my fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the Middlesex bank and lay down, deadly sick, amidst the long grass. I probably dozed, because I do not remember the arrival of the curate. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt-sleeves, and with his upturned, clean-shaven face staring at the sky. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion he looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You've been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of one another. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, scalded, naked save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, and my face and shoulders blackened from the smoke. His face was a fair weakness. His chin retreated, and his hair lay in crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "What do these things mean? Why are these things permitted? What sins have we committed? The morning service was over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death, as if it were Sodom and Gomorrah. All our work undone, all our work." He relapsed into silence, and then broke out again like one demented. "The smoke of her burning goeth up for ever and ever." His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he'd been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "What are we to do?" he cried suddenly. "Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them? This must be the beginning of the end, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne." I struggled to my feet, and standing over him laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," I said. "You're scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses at calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He's not an insurance agent." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They are invulnerable. They are pitiless." "Neither the one nor perhaps the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are, the more sane and wary should we be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." "Killed?" he said, staring about him. "How can God's ministers be killed?" "I saw it happen," I proceeded to tell him. "We have chanced to come in for the thick of it, that's all." "What is that flicker in the sky?" he asked abruptly. I told him it was a heliograph signalling that it was a sign of human help and effort in the sky. "We are in the midst of it," I said, "quiet as it is. That flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm. Yonder are the Martians and London woods, where those hills rise about Richmond and Kingston, and the trees give cover. Earthworks are being thrown up, and guns are being laid. Presently the Martians will be coming this way again." And even as I spoke, he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. "Listen," he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote, weird howling. Then everything was still. A cockchafer came droning over the hedge and past us. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton and the hot, still splendour of the sunset. "We had better follow this path," I said. "Northward, toward London." While the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, the Martians had resumed the offensive. The majority of them remained busy with preparations in the Horsell pit until about 9 that night, but 3 came out about 8 o'clock, and advancing slowly and cautiously made their way through Byfleet and Purford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body but in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. They communicated with each other by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was this howling and the firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we had heard at Halliford. The Ripley gunners were unseasoned artillery volunteers. They fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, and the Martian walked over their guns serenely without using his heat ray, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St. George's Hill men, however, were better led and of better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unexpected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they'd been on parade, and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all around the Martian, and they saw him advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged ululation, and immediately a second and third glittering giant answering him appeared over the trees to the south. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and immediately his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees all about the guns flashed into fire, and only 1 or 2 of the men who were already running over the crest of the hill escaped. The Martian who'd been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood and apparently engaged in the repair of his machine. About 9 he'd finished, for his cowl was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 Martians were joined by 4 others, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3, and the 7 proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. At the same time, 4 more similarly armed with tubes crossed the river and took up their positions in the huge crescent in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Facing that crescent everywhere, at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, behind hills and woods south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north of it, the guns were waiting. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those guns would explode into a thunderous fury of battle. Then, after what seemed an interminable time, the Martian nearest to the guns at Staines raised his tube and discharged it gunwise. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. Then a second Martian raised his tube and fired, followed swiftly by a third and a fourth, until all the Martians in that vast crescent had discharged their tubes. The earthly artillery made no reply. Everything suddenly became still as the echoes of the concussion died away. Each of the Martians had discharged at some unknown signal by means of the gun-like tube he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or other possible cover for guns chanced to be in front of him. These canisters smashed on striking the ground. They did not explode, and incontinently discharged an enormous volume of a heavy, inky vapour, coiling and pouring upwards in a huge and ebony cumulus cloud, a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. And the touch of that vapour, the inhaling of its pungent wisps, was death to all that breathed. It was heavy, this vapour, heavier than the densest smoke, so that after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sank down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous, abandoning the hills and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses. And where it came upon water, some chemical action occurred, and the surface would be instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The vapour itself did not diffuse as a true gas would do. It hung together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slope of the land and driving reluctantly before the wind. And very slowly it combined with the mist and moisture of the air and sank to the earth in the form of a dust. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke hung so closely to the ground, even before its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of high houses and even on great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether. And when it had served its purpose, the Martians cleared the air of it by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. So setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange, stifling vapour over the Londonward country. The horns of the crescent slowly spread apart until at last they formed a line from Hanwell to Malden. All night through their destructive tubes advanced. Never once after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down did they give the artillery a ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapour was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed, the heat ray was brought to bear. Before dawn, the black vapour was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with a last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight. So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning. The stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent lashing in a foaming tumult round the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping on the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organisation, and by midday even the railway organisations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last into that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled, people were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages, even at 2 o'clock. By 3, people were being trampled and crushed even in Bishopsgate Street. A couple of 100 yards or more from Liverpool Street Station, revolvers were fired, people were stabbed, and the policemen who'd been sent to direct the traffic, exhausted and infuriated, were breaking the heads of the people they'd been called out to protect. And as the day advanced and the engine drivers and stokers refused to return to London, the pressure of the flight drove the people in an ever-thickening multitude away from the stations and along the northward running roads. By midday, a Martian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black vapour drove along the Thames and across the flats at Lambeth, cutting off all escape over the bridges in its sluggish advance. Another bank drove down over Ealing and surrounded a little island of survivors on Castle Hill, alive but unable to escape. Had the Martians aimed only at destruction, they might on Monday have annihilated the entire population of London as it spread itself slowly through the home counties. Not only along the road through Barnet, but also through Edgware and Waltham Abbey, and along the roads eastward to Southend and Shoeburyness, and south of the Thames to Deal and Broadstairs, poured the same frantic rout. If one could have hung that June morning in a balloon, in the blazing blue above London, every northward and eastward road running out of the infinite tangle of streets would have seemed stippled black with streaming fugitives, each dot a human agony of terror and physical distress. Never before, in the history of the world, had such a mass of human beings moved and suffered together. The legendary hosts of Goths and Huns, the hugest armies Asia has ever seen, would have been but a drop in that current. And this was no disciplined march, it was a stampede gigantic and terrible, without order and without a goal. 6 million people unarmed and unprovisioned, driving headlong. Directly below him the balloonist would have seen the network of streets far and wide, houses, churches, squares, crescents, gardens, already derelict, spread out like a huge map. And in the south and west over Ealing, Richmond and Wimbledon it would have seemed as if some monstrous pen had flung ink upon the chart. Steadily, incessantly, each black splash grew and spread, shooting out ramifications this way and that, now banking itself against rising ground, now pouring swiftly over a crest into a new-found valley, exactly as a gout of ink would spread itself upon blotting paper. And beyond, over the blue hills that rise southward of the river, the glittering Martians went to and fro, calmly and methodically spreading their poison cloud over this patch of country and then over that. They do not seem to have aimed at extermination so much as at complete demoralization and the destruction of any organized opposition. They exploded any stores of powder they came upon, cut every telegraph, and wrecked the railways. They were hamstringing mankind. They seemed in no hurry to extend the field of their operations, and did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. It is possible that a very considerable number of people in London stuck to their houses through Monday morning. Certain it is that many died at home, suffocated by the black smoke. With the coming of the black smoke, the curate and I had taken refuge in a deserted house on some high ground outside Mortlake, and there we remained all day Monday, the day of the panic. My mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I imagined her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. My only consolation was to believe that the Martians were moving towards London and away from her. I grew very weary with the curate's perpetual lamentations. I tired of the sight of his selfish despair and kept away from him as far as possible. In the pantry of the house in which we were imprisoned, we'd found a store of food, 2 loaves of bread in a pan, an uncooked steak, and the half of a ham. Bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot beans and some limp lettuces. The pantry opened into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this was firewood, and a cupboard in which we found nearly a dozen bottles of Burgundy, tin soups and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store for the next 12 days. It was on the Monday evening, at about 11 o'clock, that the event that was to keep us imprisoned in the house for over a week took place. We were sitting in the kitchen, eating bread and ham and drinking beer, when suddenly there was a blinding flash of vivid green light. Everything in the kitchen leapt out, clearly visible in the green and black, and then vanished again. And then followed such a concussion as I have never heard before or since. So close on the heels of this as to seem instantaneous came a thud behind me, a clash of glass, a crash and a rattle of falling masonry all about us, and incontinently the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us, smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor against the oven handle and stunned. When I came to, we were in darkness, and my face was wet with blood from a cut forehead. For some time I could not recollect what had happened. Then things came to me slowly. A bruise on my temple asserted itself. "Are you better?" asked the curate in a whisper. "Don't move. The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise, and I fancy they are outside." We both sat quite silent, so that we could scarcely hear one another breathing. Everything seemed deadly still, though once something near us, some plaster or broken brickwork, slid down with a rumbling sound. Outside and very near us, an intermittent metallic rattling began to grow in intensity. "A Martian," whispered the curate. But the sound was not like that of the heat ray, and for a moment I thought that one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I'd seen one stumble against the tower of Shepperton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through the window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind us. The interior of the kitchen we now saw greyly for the first time. The window had been burst in by a mass of garden mould which flowed over the table at which we'd been sitting and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken in, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident that the greater part of the house had collapsed. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall a Martian standing sentinel over a still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that, we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight of the kitchen into the darkness of the scullery behind. Abruptly, the right interpretation of things dawned on me. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered. "The 5th shot from Mars has struck this house and buried us under the ruins." As we sat with our eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door, there began outside a metallic hammering, and then a violent hooting, and then, after a quiet interval, a hissing like the noise of a vast engine. These noises continued intermittently and seemed, if anything, to increase in number as time wore on. Presently, a measured thudding began, accompanied by a vibration that made everything about us quiver on the vessels in the pantry ring and shift. Once the light was eclipsed, and the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. The curate whispered, "God have mercy upon us." and sat quietly whimpering to himself. For a moment or so I waited, and then as the shadow passed from the kitchen doorway, I advanced, crouching and stepping with extreme care amidst the broken crockery that littered the floor. By raising myself cautiously across a fallen beam, I was able to peer through the gap in the wall into what had overnight been a quiet suburban roadway. Vast, indeed, was the change that I beheld. The fifth cylinder had fallen right into the midst of the house, directly across the road from the one in which we were hidden. The building had vanished, completely smashed, pulverized, and dispersed by the blow. The cylinder lay now far beneath the original foundations, deep in a hole already vastly larger than the pit I'd looked into at Horsell Common. The earth all round it had been splashed under that tremendous impact. Splashed is the only word, and lay in heaped piles that hid the masses of the adjacent houses. It had behaved exactly like mud under the violent blow of a hammer. Our house had collapsed backwards. The front portion, even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By a chance, the kitchen and scullery had escaped and stood buried now under the soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side, save towards the cylinder. Over that aspect we hung now on the very verge of the great circular pit that the Martians were engaged in making. The cylinder was already opened in the centre of the pit, and on the farther edge, amidst the smashed and gravel-heaped shrubbery, one of the great fighting machines stood, deserted by its occupant, stiff and tall against the evening sky. And busy in the excavation was an extraordinary glittering mechanism, one of those complicated fabrics that have since been called handling machines. It was a sort of metallic spider with 5 agile legs and an extraordinary number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Its motion was so swift, complex, and perfect that at first I did not see it as a machine, in spite of its metallic glitter. The fighting machines were coordinated and animated to an extraordinary pitch, but nothing to compare with this. My interest shifted to the Martians themselves, busy in the pit. Already I'd had a transient impression of these, and the first nausea no longer obscured my observation. They were the most unearthly creatures it is possible to conceive. They were huge, round bodies, or rather heads, about 4 feet in diameter, each body having in front of it a face. This face had no nostrils. Indeed, the Martians do not seem to have had any sense of smell. But it had a pair of very large, dark-coloured eyes, and just beneath this a kind of fleshy beak. In the back of this head, or body, I scarcely know how to speak of it, was the single tight tympanic surface, since known to be anatomically an ear, though it must have been almost useless in our denser atmosphere. In a group round the mouth were 16 slender, almost whip-like tentacles arranged in 2 bunches of 8 each. Dissection has since shown that in addition to the great brain, the Martians possessed complex lungs and a heart, but this was the sum total of their internal organs. Strange as it may seem to a human being, all the complex apparatus of digestion which makes up the bulk of our bodies did not exist in the Martians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I myself have seen this being done, and squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. Suffice to say that blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases a human being, was run directly into the recipient canal by means of a little pipette. The bare idea of this is no doubt horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit. Perhaps the most salient point in which the systems of the Martians differed from ours, however, was in what one might have thought a very trivial particular. Microorganisms, which cause so much disease and pain on Earth, have either never appeared upon Mars, or Martian sanitary science eliminated them years ago. 100 diseases, all the fevers and contagions of human life, consumption, cancers, tumours, and such morbidities, never enter the scheme of their life. As I watched the Martians lying in the sunset light, panting, stirring ineffectual tentacles and moving feebly after their vast journey across space, it seemed to me that the crab-like handling machine looked to be infinitely more alive than they. While I was still watching, the curate reminded me of his presence by pulling violently at my arm. I turned to a scowling face and silent, eloquent lips. He wanted the slit, which permitted only one of us to peep through at a time, and so I had to forego watching them for a time while he enjoyed that privilege. When I looked again, the busy handling machine had already put together several of the pieces of apparatus it had taken out of the cylinder into a shape having an unmistakable likeness to its own. And down on the left, a busy little digging mechanism had come into view. This digging machine was emitting jets of green vapor and working its way round the pit, excavating and embanking in a methodical and discriminating manner. This it was which had caused the regular beating noise and the rhythmic shocks that had kept our ruinous refuge quivering. It piped and whistled as it worked, and so far as I could see, the thing was without a directing Martian at all. The arrival of a second fighting machine drove us from our peephole into the scullery, for we feared that from his elevation the Martian might see down upon us behind our barrier. As time wore on, we began to feel less in danger of their eyes, for to an eye in the dazzle of the sunlight outside, our refuge must have seemed a blind of blackness. But at first the slightest suggestion of approach drove us into the scullery in heart-throbbing retreat. Yet, terrible as was the danger we incurred, the attraction of peeping became for both of us irresistible. And I recall now with a sort of wonder that in spite of the infinite danger in which we were, between starvation and a still more terrible death, we could yet struggle bitterly for that horrible privilege of sight. We would race across the kitchen in a grotesque pace between eagerness and the dread of making a noise, and strike one another and thrust and kick within a few inches of exposure. The curate and I had absolutely incompatible dispositions and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. His endless muttering monologues vitiated every effort I made to think out a line of action, and drove me at times, thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He was as lacking in restraint as a silly woman. He would weep for hours together, and I would sit in the darkness unable to keep my mind off him by reason of his importunities. He ate more than I did, and it was in vain I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop in the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in that long patience a time might presently come when we should need food. He ate and drank impulsively in heavy meals at long intervals. He slept little. The curate had possession of the aperture when the first men were brought to the pit. He made a sudden movement backwards, and I, fearful that we were observed, crouched in a spasm of terror. He came sliding down the rubbish and crouched beside me in the darkness, inarticulate, gesticulating, and for a moment I shared his terror. After a little while my curiosity gave me courage, and I clambered up to the slit. At first I could see no reason for his terror. The twilight had come now, the stars were little and faint, but the pit was illuminated by a flickering green fire. The sprawling Martians were no longer to be seen. A fighting machine with its legs contracted, crumpled, and abbreviated stood across the corner of the pit. And then, amidst the clangour of the machinery, came a drifting suspicion of human voices that I entertained at first only to dismiss. I crouched, watching the fighting machine closely. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oily gleam of the Martian inside and the brightness of his eyes. And suddenly I heard a yell, and saw a long tentacle reaching over the shoulder of the machine to a little cage that hunched upon its back. Then something struggling violently was lifted high against the sky, a black enigma against the starlight, and as this black object came down again, I saw by the green brightness that it was a man. For an instant he was clearly visible. He was a stout, ruddy, middle-aged man, well-dressed. 3 days before he must have been walking the world a man of considerable consequence. I could see his staring eyes and gleams of light on his studs and watch chain. He vanished behind the mound, and for a moment there was silence. And then began a shrieking and a sustained and cheerful hooting from the Martian. I slid down the rubbish, struggled to my feet, clapped my hands over my ears, and bolted into the scullery. That night, as we lurked in the scullery, balanced between our horror and the horrible fascination this peeping had, although I felt an urgent need of action, I tried in vain to conceive any plan of escape. But afterwards, during the second day, I was able to consider our position with great clearness. The curate, I found, was quite incapable of discussion. Strange terrors had robbed him of reason or forethought. It grew upon my mind, once I could face the facts, that terrible as our position was, there was as yet no justification for absolute despair. Our chief chance lay in the possibility of the Martians making the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment. I also weighed very carefully the possibility of our digging our way out in a direction away from the pit, and I actually spent the better part of that day in the scullery, digging with a hatchet as silently as possible. But when I'd made a hole about a couple of feet deep, the loose earth collapsed noisily, and I did not dare continue. After that I abandoned altogether the idea of escaping by excavation. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peeped for the last time, and presently found myself alone. Instead of keeping close to me and trying to oust me from the slit, the curate had gone back into the scullery. I was struck by a sudden thought. I went back quickly and quietly into the scullery. In the darkness I heard the curate drinking. I snatched in the darkness, and my fingers caught a bottle of Burgundy. For a few moments there was a tussle. The bottle struck the floor and broke. We stood panting, threatening one another. In the end I planted myself between him and the food, and told him of my determination to begin a discipline. I divided the food in the pantry into rations to last us 10 days. I would not let him eat any more that day. And so our widened incompatibility ended at last in open conflict. For 2 vast days we struggled in undertones and wrestling conflicts. There were times when I beat and kicked him madly, times when I cajoled and persuaded him, and once I tried to bribe him with the last bottle of Burgundy. But neither force nor kindness prevailed. He was indeed beyond reason. On the 8th day he began to talk aloud instead of whispering, and nothing I could do would moderate his speech. "It is just, O God," he would say over and over again. "It is just. On me and mine be the punishment laid. We have sinned, we have fallen short." Then he suddenly reverted to the matter of the food I withheld from him, praying, begging, weeping, at last threatening. He began to raise his voice. I prayed him not to, but he perceived a hold on me. He threatened he would shout and bring the Martians upon us. I defied him, although I felt no assurance that he might not do this thing. But that day, at any rate, he did not. He talked with his voice rising slowly through the greater part of the 8th and 9th days, threats, entreaties, mingled with a torrent of half-sane and always frothy repentance for his vacant sham of God's service. Then he slept a while and began again with renewed strength so loudly that I must needs make him desist. "Be still," I implored. He rose to his knees, for he had been sitting in the darkness near the copper. "I have been still too long," he said in a tone that must have reached the pit, "and now I must bear witness. Woe unto this unfaithful city! Woe to the inhabitants of this earth!" "Shut up!" I said, rising to my feet, and in a terror lest the Martians should hear us. "Nay, I must speak," he shouted at the top of his voice. "The word of the Lord is upon me." In 3 strides he was at the door of the kitchen. "I must bear witness. I must go. It has already been too long delayed." I put out my hand and felt the meat chopper hanging on the wall. In a flash I was after him. I was fierce with fear. Before he was halfway across the kitchen, I'd overtaken him. With one last touch of humanity, I turned the blade back and struck him with the butt. He went headlong forward and lay stretched on the ground. I stumbled over him and stood panting. He lay still. Abruptly I heard a noise without, the run and smash of slipping plaster, and the aperture in the wall was darkened. I looked up and saw the lower surface of a handling machine coming slowly across the hole. One of its gripping limbs curled amidst the debris. Another limb appeared, feeling its way over the fallen beams. I stood petrified, staring. Then I saw through a sort of glass plate the face and the large dark eyes of a Martian peering. And then a long metallic snake of tentacle came feeling slowly through the hole. I turned by an effort, stumbled over the curate and made for the scullery door. The tentacle was now some 2 yards or more into the room, and twisting and turning with queer sudden movements this way and that, I forced myself across the scullery, opened the door of the coal cellar, and stood there in the darkness, staring back at the faintly lit doorway into the kitchen, and listening. Then I heard the sound of a heavy body. I knew only too well it was the wretched curate's, being dragged across the floor of the kitchen towards the aperture. I crept into the coal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself up as much as I could, and as noiselessly as possible in the darkness, among the firewood and coal. I had no idea if the Martian was aware of my presence, and every now and then I paused to hear if it had thrust its tentacle through the opening again. Some time passed, and then the faint metallic jingle returned. I heard it slowly feeling over the kitchen. Presently I heard it nearer, in the scullery, I judged, and I prayed that its length might be insufficient to reach the door of the coal cellar. An age of almost intolerable suspense intervened. Then I heard it fumbling at the latch. It had found the door. The Martian understood doors. It worried at the catch for a minute, perhaps, and then the door opened. In the darkness I could just see the thing, like an elephant trunk more than anything else, waving towards me, and touching and examining the walls, the ceiling, the wood, and the coals. Once even it touched the heel of my boot. I was on the verge of screaming. I bit my hand. Then I heard the slow, deliberate sound creeping away from me, out through the cellar door. I heard it go into the pantry, and the biscuit tins rattled and a bottle smashed. And then came silence that passed into an infinity of suspense. I lay the whole of the 10th day in the coal cellar, in the close darkness, buried among coals and firewood, not daring even to crawl out for the drink which I craved. It was the 11th day before I could bring myself to venture out from my hiding place. My throat was so painful that, taking the chance of alarming the Martians, I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink and got a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. I was greatly refreshed by this, and emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping. I dozed and thought disjointedly of vague, impossible plans of escape. Whenever I slept, I dreamt of horrible phantasms, of the curate and of the manner of his death, or of sumptuous dinners. It was early on the 12th day that I heard a curious, familiar sequence of sounds in the kitchen, and listening, identified it as the snuffing and scratching of a dog. Going into the kitchen, I saw a dog's nose peering in through the aperture. At the scent of me, he barked shortly. I crept forward, saying, "Good dog," very softly, but he suddenly withdrew his head and disappeared. I listened. The pit outside was still. I heard a sound like the flutter of a bird's wings and a horse croaking, but that was all. Once or twice I heard a faint pitter-patter like the feet of the dog going hither and thither on the sand far below me. For a long while I lay close to the peephole, and at length, encouraged by the silence, I looked out. Except in the corner, where a multitude of crows hopped and fought over the skeletons of the dead which the Martians had consumed, there was not a living thing in the pit. All the machinery had gone. Slowly I thrust myself out through the aperture and stared about me. I could see in every direction save behind me to the north, and neither Martian nor sign of Martian was to be seen. The pit dropped sheerly from my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practicable slope to the summit of the ruins. I scrambled to the top of the mound and looked to the northward. No Martian was visible. When I'd last seen this part of Mortlake in the daylight, it had been a straggling street of comfortable white and red houses interspersed with abundant shady trees. Now I stood on a mound of smashed brickwork, clay, and gravel. The neighbouring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their walls stood sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. Below me was the great pit, with the crows struggling for its refuse. Far away I saw a gaunt cat slink crouchingly along a wall, but traces of men there were none. For some time I stood tottering on the mound, regardless of my safety, for at that moment I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies digging the foundations of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of men had passed away. But as soon as this strangeness had been realized, it passed, and my dominant motive became the hunger of my long and dismal fast. I had no plans for going anywhere in particular, for I did not know where to go. My dominant thought was of food, and with that in mind I set off roughly in an easterly direction. It took me 2 days to reach central London, and in all that time I saw no human beings, and no sign of the Martians. I encountered a couple of hungry-looking dogs, but both hurried circuitously away from the advances I made them. About a mile down the road from the pit I found in a ruined greenhouse some young onions, a couple of gladioli bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I devoured ravenously. And in a garden outside Putney I discovered a quantity of potatoes sufficient to stay my hunger. From this garden one saw down upon Putney and the river. The aspect of the place in the dusk was singularly desolate. Blackened trees, desolate ruins, and over all, silence. It filled me with indescribable terror to think how swiftly that desolating change had come. For a time I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence. I became convinced that I was alone, the last man alive, and that the extermination of mankind was, save for such stragglers as myself, already accomplished in this part of the world. The Martians, I thought, had gone on, and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps even now they were destroying Berlin or Paris. There was black dust along the roadway from Putney Bridge, and it grew thicker towards Fulham. The streets were horribly quiet. I got food, sour, hard, and mouldy, but quite eatable, in a baker's shop there. Some way towards Walham Green the streets became clear of the black powder, and I passed a white terrace of houses on fire. The noise of the burning was an absolute relief. Going in towards Brompton, the streets were quiet again. Here I came once more upon the black powder in the streets, and also several dead bodies. I saw altogether about a dozen in the length of the Fulham Road. They had been dead many days, so that I hurried quickly past them. The black powder covered them over and softened their outlines. 1 or 2 had been disturbed by dogs. Where there was no black powder, it was curiously like Sunday in the city, with its closed shops, the houses locked up and the blinds drawn, the desertion and the stillness. In some places plunderers had been at work, but rarely at other than the provision and wine shops. A jeweller's window had been broken open in one place, but apparently the thief had been disturbed, and a number of gold chains and a watch were scattered on the pavement. Further on was a tattered woman in a heap on a doorstep. The hand that hung over her knee was gashed and bled down her rusty brown dress, and a smashed magnum of champagne formed a pool across the pavement. She seemed asleep, but she was dead. In South Kensington the streets were clear of dead and of black powder. It was near South Kensington that I first heard the howling. It crept almost imperceptibly upon my senses. It was a sobbing alternation of 2 notes, "Oola, oola, oola," keeping on perpetually. When I passed streets that ran northwards, it increased in volume, and houses and buildings seemed to deaden and cut it off again. It came to a full tide down Exhibition Road. I stopped, staring towards Kensington Gardens, wondering at this strange, remote wailing. It was as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice for its fear and its solitude. "Oola, oola, oola," wailed that superhuman note, great waves of sound sweeping down the broad sunlit roadway between the tall buildings on either side. I turned northward, marvelling towards the iron gates of Hyde Park. All the large mansions on either side of the road were empty and still, and my footsteps echoed against the sides of the houses. I entered the park and approached as far as the bridge over the Serpentine. The howling grew stronger and stronger, that I could see nothing above the housetops on the north side of the park, save a haze of smoke to the northwest. I came into Oxford Street by the Marble Arch, and here again was the black powder and several bodies, and an evil, ominous smell from the gratings of the cellars of some of the houses. I wandered on through the silent residential squares to Baker Street, and so came out at last upon Regent's Park. I came upon the wrecked handling machine just by one of the entrances to Regent's Park. At first I thought a house had fallen across the road. It was only as I clambered among the ruins that I saw with a start this mechanical Samson lying, with its tentacles bent and smashed and twisted, among the ruins it had made. The forepart was shattered. It seemed as if it had driven blindly straight at the house and been overwhelmed in its overthrow. As I pushed on into the park, I saw far away through a gap in the trees a second handling machine, motionless as the first. And then, abruptly, the howling ceased. It was, as it were, cut off. The silence came like a thunderclap. Night, the mother of fear and mystery, was coming upon me. While that strange howling had sounded, the solitude, the desolation had been endurable. By virtue of it, London seemed strangely alive, and the sense of life about me had upheld me. Then, suddenly, a change, the passing of something, I knew not what, and then a stillness that could be felt. Nothing but this gaunt quiet. Terror seized me, and I turned and ran blindly back out of the park. I found myself in St. John's Wood Road, and I ran headlong from this unendurable stillness. At last, breathless and exhausted, I found a cabman's shelter in the Harrow Road, and there I hid from the night and the silence. Just before dawn, my courage returned, and while the stars were still in the sky, I turned once more towards Regent's Park. I missed my way among the streets and presently saw down a long avenue, in the half-light of the early dawn, the curve of Primrose Hill. On the summit, towering up to the fading stars, was a third handling machine, erect and motionless like the others. An insane resolve possessed me. I would die and end it, and I would save myself even the trouble of killing myself. I marched on recklessly towards this Titan, and then, as I drew nearer and the light grew, I saw that a multitude of black birds was circling and clustering about the hood. At that my heart gave a bound, and I began running along the road. I hurried down St. Edmund's Terrace and emerged upon the grass before the rising of the sun. Great mounds had been heaped about the crest of the hill, making a huge redoubt of it. It was the final and largest place the Martians made, and from behind these heaps there rose a thin smoke against the sky. Against the skyline an eager dog ran and disappeared. The thought that had flashed into my mind grew real, grew credible. I felt no fear, only a wild, trembling exultation as I ran up the hill towards the motionless monster. Out of the hood hung lank shreds of brown, at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In another moment I had scrambled up the earthen rampart and stood on its crest, and the interior of the redoubt was below me. A mighty space it was, with gigantic machines here and there within it, huge mounds of material and strange shelter places, and scattered about it, some in their overturned war machines, some in the now rigid handling machines, and a dozen of them stark and silent and laid in a row, were the Martians, all dead. Here and there they were scattered, nearly 50 altogether, in that great gulf they had made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. To me also at that time this death was incomprehensible. All I knew was that these things that had been alive and so terrible to men were dead. I stood staring into the pit, and my heart lightened gloriously, even as the rising sun struck the world to fire about me with his rays. The pit was still in darkness. The mighty engines, so great and wonderful in their power and complexity, so unearthly in their tortuous forms, rose weird and vague and strange out of the shadows towards the light. Across the pit on its further lip, flat and vast and strange, lay the great flying machine, with which they had been experimenting upon our denser atmosphere when decay and death arrested them. Death had not come a day too soon. At the sound of cawing overhead, I looked up at the huge fighting machine that would fight no more, at the tattered red shreds of flesh that dripped down upon the overturned seats on the summit of Primrose Hill. It had died even as it had been crying to its companions. Perhaps it was the last to die, and its voice had gone on perpetually until the force of its machinery was exhausted. It glittered now, harmless tripod towers of shining metal in the brightness of the rising sun. All about the pit, and saved as by a miracle from everlasting destruction, stretched the great mother of cities. Those who have only seen London veiled in her sombre robes of smoke can scarcely imagine the naked clearness and beauty of the silent wilderness of houses. Eastward, over the blackened ruins of the Albert Terrace and the splintered spire of the church, the sun blazed dazzling in a clear sky, and here and there some facet in the great wilderness of roofs caught the light and glared with a white intensity. Northward were Kilburn and Hampstead, blue and crowded with houses. Westward the great city was dimmed, and southward beyond the Martians, the green waves of Regent's Park, the Langham Hotel, the dome of the Albert Hall, the Imperial Institute, and the giant mansions of the Brompton Road came out clear and little in the sunrise, the jagged ruins of Westminster rising hazily beyond. Far away and blue were the Surrey hills, and the towers of the Crystal Palace glittered like two silver rods. The dome of St. Paul's was dark against the sunrise, and injured, I saw for the first time, by a huge gaping cavity on its western side. And as I looked at this wide expanse of houses and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, as I thought of the multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone to build this human reef, and of the swift and ruthless destruction that had hung over it all, when I realized that the shadow had been rolled back and that men might still live in the streets, and this dear, vast city of mine be once more alive and powerful, I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. Of the next 3 days I remember nothing. I have learned since that far from my being the first discoverer of the Martian overthrow, several such wanderers as myself had already discovered this on the previous night. One man, the first, had gone to St. Martin's-le-Grand, and while I sheltered in the cabman's hut had contrived to telegraph to Paris. Thence the joyful news had flashed all over the world. 1,000 cities, chilled by ghastly apprehensions, suddenly flashed into frantic illumination. They knew of it in Dublin, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham at the time when I stood upon the verge of the pit. Already men weeping with joy, as I have heard, shouting and staying their work to shake hands and shout, were making up trains to descend upon London. The church bells that had ceased a fortnight since suddenly caught the news until all England was bell-ringing. Men on cycles, lean-faced, unkempt, scorched along every country lane, shouting of unhoped deliverance, shouting to gaunt, staring figures of despair. And the food! Across the Channel, across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic, corn, bread and meat were tearing to our relief. All the shipping in the world seemed going Londonward in those days. But of all this I have no memory. I drifted, a demented man. I found myself in the house of kindly people who had found me on the third day, wandering, weeping and raving through the streets of St. John's Wood. Troubled as they were with their own affairs, they sheltered and fed me, and very gently, when my mind was assured again, they told me what they had learnt of the fate of Leatherhead. 2 days after I was imprisoned in the house at Mortlake, it had been destroyed, with every soul in it, by a Martian. He had swept it out of existence, as it seemed, without any provocation, as a boy might crush an anthill, in the mere wantonness of power. I cannot but regret, now that I am concluding my story, how little I am able to contribute to the discussion of the many debatable questions which are still unsettled. My particular province is speculative philosophy. My knowledge of comparative physiology is confined to a book or two, but it seems to me that Carver's suggestion as to the reason for the rapid death of the Martians is so probable as to be regarded almost as a proven conclusion. They were slain, it seems, by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Slain, after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things of all that God in his wisdom has put upon this earth. It had come about in a way that I and many men might indeed have foreseen had not terror and disaster blinded our minds. These germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestors since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power. To no germs do we succumb without a struggle, and to many, those that cause putrefaction in dead matter, for instance, our living frames are altogether immune. But there are no bacteria on Mars. And directly those invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. They were irrevocably doomed, even as they went to and fro, and the end was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the earth, and it is his against all comers. It would still be his were the Martians 10 times as mighty as they are. In all the bodies of the Martians that were examined after the war, no bacteria except those already known as terrestrial species were found. That they did not bury any of their dead, and the reckless slaughter they perpetrated, point also to an entire ignorance of the putrefactive process. The generator of the heat ray remains a puzzle, and the composition of the black smoke which the Martians used with such deadly effect is not known. Spectrum analysis of the black powder points unmistakably to the presence of an unknown element with a brilliant group of 3 lines in the green, and it is possible that it combines with argon to form a compound which acts at once with deadly effect upon some constituent in the blood. But such speculations, both on the nature of the Martians themselves and on the materials and methods at their disposal, must remain unproven. Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today. Our views of the human future have been greatly modified by the terrible events I have described. We have learned now that we cannot regard this planet as being fenced in and a secure hiding place for man. And it may be that in the larger design of the universe, this invasion from Mars is not without its ultimate benefit for men. At least it has robbed us of that serene confidence in the future which is the most fruitful source of decadence. The gifts to human science it has brought are enormous, and it has done much to promote the conception of the common weal of mankind. The broadening of man's views that has resulted can scarcely be exaggerated. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion that through all the deep of space no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. Now we see further. On clear nights I stand in my garden and gaze up and out across all those millions of miles to where the tiny red dot that is Mars winks and sparkles in the night sky. It may be that across the great immensities of space the Martians have watched the fate of those pioneers of theirs and learned their lesson, that they will turn their attention to other planets in the solar system and never again come near this little Earth of ours. It may be, on the other hand, that the destruction of the Martians is only a reprieve for us, that even now they are preparing, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike again.